December 1941. An encrypted order from Washington sped across the wires to Admiral Thomas Hart's headquarters in Manila. Direct from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The directive defied all military logic. Send 3 small, lightly armed vessels, no destroyers, no submarines, into the waters off Indochina where the Japanese fleet was consolidating its power. One schooner was to patrol near Cam Ranh Bay, another off Cape St. Jacques, and a third near the southern tip of Vietnam. Each would fly the American flag. Each was instructed to observe, report, and maintain its station. Hart was astonished. These ships were too slow to flee, too frail to fight, and too few to be tactically relevant. They would be transformed into easy targets in hostile waters. Unless, that was precisely the objective. In the final days of November 1941, the possibility of war in the Pacific was escalating hourly. U.S. intelligence had spotted Japanese forces massing off the Indo-Chinese coast. War seemed inevitable, but its starting point was anyone's guess. The Philippines, Malaya, and perhaps even Singapore were all potential targets. Amid this uncertainty, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a secret and rather peculiar directive. Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, relayed the order to Admiral Thomas Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet in Manila. Hart was instantly alarmed by the order, not just by its content, but by the strange terminology it employed. President directs that the following be done as soon as possible. Charter 3 small vessels to form a, quote, defensive information patrol, unquote. Minimum requirements to establish identity as United States men of war are commanded by a naval officer, and to mount a small gun and 1 machine gun would suffice. Filipino crews may be employed with minimum naval ratings to accomplish purpose, which is to observe and report by radio Japanese movements. Top secret. The fact that a seemingly innocuous mission came directly from the president was unusual enough, but the last line made Hart look twice. Top secret. He also questioned how these predominantly Filipino-manned ships were expected to provide reliable intelligence. Multiple sources were already providing constant information indicating that a Japanese invasion force was assembling on Hainan Island and in Vichy-controlled French Indochina. No standard Navy ships were to be used. Only the aging USS Isabel, a converted yacht, would come from Navy stock. The other 2 would be chartered civilian schooners, hastily converted for military use. The Asiatic Fleet, largely a symbolic force composed of 3 cruisers, 13 ancient World War I-era 4-stack destroyers, and no fighter planes, did possess one significant asset: 27 submarines. These subs were not only capable of performing reconnaissance missions from the surface, but could do so covertly. In his November 25th report, Admiral Hart sternly requested additional aerial reconnaissance, pointing out that the elevated terrain made ship-based observation both cumbersome and inefficient. He also warned that picket ships would face greater danger than aircraft. These 3 small vessels would not bring any new information about Japan's naval movements. To Hart, the order bordered on the irrational. The only logical explanation was that the president intended these ships to be attacked. A patrol plane shot down in hostile waters might simply vanish, but a U.S.-flagged schooner sunk by a Japanese torpedo would make headlines. The news would surely reach the American public back home. The White House never used the phrase, but Hart perceived what it might be: a tripwire operation. President Roosevelt was convinced the U.S. needed to join the global fight against fascism. But the American public, exhausted by World War I, longed for peace. His conviction was so strong that during the Argentia Conference off the coast of Newfoundland in early August 1941, President Roosevelt gave Prime Minister Winston Churchill a firm assurance. If Japan launched an attack on British or Dutch colonies in the Far East, Britain could count on military support from the United States. But Roosevelt could not commit U.S. forces to aid the British without a congressional declaration of war. And Congress was beholden to a public that remained staunchly isolationist. Barely 20% supported entering the conflict. At the War Council meeting on November 25th, the same day the Thanksgiving warning was issued, Secretary of War Henry Stimson posed the essential question: how to get Japan to fire the first shot? No one had an answer. But at the subsequent meeting on November 28th, as Roosevelt prepared a personal message to Emperor Hirohito, someone brought up the Panay incident, the accidental sinking of a U.S. gunboat by Japan in 1937, an event that had nearly drawn the U.S. into war. There is no surviving record of what was said at the December 1st meeting, the one that produced the Three Small Vessels Directive, but historians believe its focus was clear. What happens if Japan attacks only British or Dutch colonies? Singapore, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies, but avoids American soil? How do we respond if the Philippines remain untouched? The likely answer was to find a way to force Japan's hand, create a scenario where they strike first, where they sink an American ship. Starting the war on America's terms instead of Japan's was invaluable. Losing 3 decoy ships to avoid a possible massive Japanese surprise attack was deemed worth the questionable ethics of the operation. While suspecting, but not knowing the possible true motivations of the mission, Hart continued to make the preparations. The schooner Lanakai was commandeered in Manila, crewed by Americans and Filipinos, and placed under the command of a young lieutenant, Kemp Tolley. Isabel was also readied. A third schooner, the Molly Moore, was also selected. The men were briefed. Their task was to carefully shadow the Japanese Navy, blend into the waters of Indochina, and radio back if the invasion fleet stirred. They were the eyes of a nation on the brink. The crews aboard Lanakai and Isabel worked quickly. Tolley, given command of Lanakai, later described his orders with some discomfort. Sail close to Cam Bay, where the Japanese fleet lay anchored, and report if it began moving south. It was a monumental undertaking, one meant for an entire task force. As it stood, it was one sailboat against the Empire's navy. By December 7th, the ships were nearly ready to depart. They were stripped of confidential material, issued false cover stories, and told to scuttle if necessary. Isabel's captain was told to broadcast a decoy message about searching for a downed patrol plane. Lanakai's guns, a single 3-pounder and a machine gun, were little more than decoration. What mattered was the flag, the presence, the possibility that one of these tiny vessels might be sunk. It did occur to some of the men that they were being used as bait, but they dismissed the notion. They chose to believe their country would never use them like that. Lanakai and Isabel waited in the harbor, positioned along Japan's expected invasion path. On the night of December 7, 1941, Manila Bay was still. The Lanakai crew prepared for departure. Engines warmed, charts were studied. Tolley stood on deck, unaware that a world-altering message was en route. In the early hours of December 8th, local time, the news broke. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. 8 battleships were hit. Over 2,400 Americans were lost. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Roosevelt's carefully laid tripwire operation was no longer needed. The war had arrived, not with a sunken schooner, but with a sucker punch to the heart of the American Navy. Admiral Hart immediately canceled the patrol mission. Lanakai never sailed for Cam Bay. Isabel never shadowed the Japanese fleet. Molly Moore was never even outfitted. In Washington, Roosevelt appeared shaken. Navy Secretary Frank Knox later recalled, "He expected to get hit, but not hurt." Historians would debate that quote for decades. Some conspiracy theorists argue that Roosevelt wanted war, especially with Germany, just as the McCollum Memo from 1940 had envisioned. Pressure Japan, provoke a strike, and enter the war through the back door. But Roosevelt miscalculated badly. In the years after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's motives became a battlefield. Critics pointed to his escalating pressure on Japan, the embargo, the relocation of the fleet to Hawaii, and the hardened diplomatic stance as steps meant to force a confrontation. Revisionists like John T. Flynn and later Robert Stinnett argued that Roosevelt had sought exactly this result. Stinnett's 1999 book, Day of Deceit, presented declassified documents, including the McCollum Memo, a detailed step-by-step guide on how to stay ahead of Japan as both sides escalated toward war. This allegedly proved that Roosevelt wanted Japan to fire the first shot. However, the official account doesn't even entertain the possibility. It is crystal clear: Roosevelt wanted to deter Japan, not invite disaster. He was preparing for war, not orchestrating it. Top military advisors like General Marshall and Admiral Stark had urged him as late as November to avoid conflict with Japan. U.S. war plans called for Europe first. Germany, not Japan, was the true enemy. Yet, Roosevelt could not ignore Japan's moves either. Washington risked looking weak if Japan seized Southeast Asia's resources while bypassing U.S. holdings. Worse, Japan's rise would jeopardize the Allied cause in the Pacific. Under this official view, the small vessels were likely a compromise. Visible enough to detect Japanese aggression, but modest enough not to provoke it. Roosevelt's actions can be seen as those of a man boxed in by isolationist politics, aggressive Axis powers, timing, and geography. But there is still a possibility, backed by the strange December 1st order, which suggests that if it wasn't for Pearl Harbor, FDR would have gone to extreme lengths, even sacrificing the lives of U.S. servicemen, to enter a war he knew the U.S. was destined to put an end to.